As we get the details on some of the Dolphins' new free agent signings, the landscape of the Dolphins' salary cap and roster for 2024 begins to shift. We're looking at that here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Tip the cap to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. Here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We're looking at some of the storylines for the Dolphins with this offseason roster. Not necessarily as simple as who's going to make the 53? What's the best combination of 53? How to get the best combination of guys for offense, defense, and special teams? But the economic portion of it is really interesting with where the Dolphins are at right now. We just got the Marcus May contract details courtesy of Over the Cap this morning. And it is a veteran minimum contract, but it's been mentioned already by 3 yards per carries Chris Kaufman, who is a former guest on this show. He's an excellent Dolphins content creator, but he made the point to point out that the Dolphins, and they've done it with a number of free agents that they have signed this offseason, they are taking advantage of a rule that was put into the new collective bargaining agreement that's intended to make sure that veteran players can find spots on rosters and not just be replaced by cheap rookie talents with no questions asked. It's known as the veteran salary benefit. And the Dolphins did this with Marcus May, just as they've done it, as Chris Kaufman points out, with Anthony Walker and Tier Tart and Nick Needham and Deshaun Hand and Cam Brown. You can give a player what their minimum salary is based on their tenure in the league and a capped signing bonus, but not all of what they receive in cash counts against the salary cap, because this rule is intended to say you as a player, as you gain more tenure, your minimum salary increases. But to incentivize teams to not pass you by over a few $100,000 in favor of a second-year player that they could sign off the street, we're going to only count the non-tenured portion of your minimum salary against the salary cap. So Miami, for Marcus May as example, he's due thanks to his tenure in the league, and this is exactly the same contract as Anthony Walker. $1.21 million minimum salary with a $167,500, I guess is the right way to say it, signing bonus. So in total, both of those players are receiving almost $1.4 million in cash, and yet they only count for 1.15 against the salary cap apiece, because the minimum salary is $985,000. So you take the $985 plus the $167,000 signing bonus. So that's the difference. Like, those are the margins that Miami is working in right now. And as Chris Kaufman pointed out, they did it with Cam Brown and Tier Tart and Nick Needham and Deshaun Hand, and now they've done it with Marcus May. That's an outstanding value contract for Marcus May, who is a player who is a long-tenured starter, durability issues the past few years, but to be a third safety and be in the picture, and we kind of alluded to that last week when we knew that they were signing Marcus May, was like, hey, it feels like Miami's committed to Jordan Porter being the second safety on this depth chart. So I wouldn't expect the investment for Marcus May to surpass that of Jordan Poyer. And sure enough, Jordan Poyer's on the books for just under $2 million. Marcus May is almost half of that. For a player who is as experienced and showcases as much juice and life as Marcus May has shown, but put him in a role where he plays a much more select amount of snaps in any given week to give him a better chance of playing throughout the course of an entire season, you're looking at really good ROI with contracts like that. Really good potential ROI. And that's kind of where Miami's at, as a favorable destination and a team that's contending with a savvy front office from this perspective. Offering veteran players, we have our core players, and on an annual basis, we're going to try to complement them with as many economically friendly pieces as we possibly can, right? It's all the same storylines we've been talking about all off season long, but we have a new data point with it with Marcus May. The one that we don't have is Calais Campbell. I would not expect Calais Campbell to be somebody who is in that same ballpark and stratosphere. I expect this is going to be a significant salary cap investment for Miami. Now, they have ways in which they can mitigate if they're going to pay him in cash. I believe he played for about $7.5 million in cash last season. If he did that, there's no reason why Miami could not theoretically do what they're doing with Shaq Barrett to give a competitive contract, but not pay the full price of it up front. Although they have the wiggle room to absorb the whole thing if they want to. I'd kind of be surprised if they did. I would expect there's some gymnastics within that contract for Calais Campbell. But right now, you lay it out. The Dolphins only have a handful of players above a $5 million salary cap hit for 2023 or for 2024. It includes Tyreek Hill, who that may be reduced, right? If they end up reworking that contract, how do they rework that contract? Do they just move cash around and use some of their wiggle room cap space to absorb it? Do they put an extension year on the back end and kind of rework all 3 years, in which case they can reduce the year one salary? With salary right now, he's due about $20 million in base salary that you could redistribute as a bonus if you did more to the contract. That number could go down. Tua Tagovailoa's 23.17 could theoretically go down. This is the second largest, highest cap hit on the team, is the $23 million salary cap hit for Tua Tagovailoa. They continue to work towards a long-term contract extension with him. Bradley Chubb and Teron Armstead are the only other two contracts on the books for the Dolphins this year with salary caps more than $10 million. Bradley Chubb, they restructured a portion of his salary. Teron Armstead, they reworked that whole contract for this upcoming season to kind of amend his salary and compensation. Then you have Waddle, Ramsey, David Long, Zach Sealer, and backup quarterback Mike White. Those are the only salary cap hits in excess of $5 million. I'd expect Calais Campbell to potentially be in that stratosphere. If they don't, I expect from a cash perspective, he'll certainly be in that stratosphere. If they do what they did with Shaq Barrett, he may end up checking in somewhere around 2.5, which is where Shaq Barrett's at, which is a whole other stratosphere. There's a whole bunch of other players between that $5 million cutoff and where Shaq Barrett checks in. The point being this, Miami's salary cap outlook and its implications for a 53-man roster, it's starting to become very interesting because it's very competitive. There's a lot here. And that's what we're going to look at the rest of the show. We're going to look at starting with who's on the outside looking in, right? Like, what is the current salary cap situation before we know the terms of the Calais Campbell signing? What the implications of that may look like, and then ultimately look at who's not amongst the top 51 players, right? Because for these gymnastics that Miami's playing with veteran contracts like Marcus May and Cam Brown and so on and so forth, there's players on rookie contracts that are going to make the team. And that means players above the 51-man cutoff are not going to make the team. And that creates some really interesting dynamics as far as what this roster can look like when we get to September. We're going to look at all that next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals. NHL Finals tonight, Stanley Cup Final, Game 5, Florida Panthers hoping to bring home the trophy. We're hoping to see this not extend and go back to Edmonton for Game 6. But regardless of where your eyes are at in the sporting world, you can get in on all of the action with FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from the NHL Finals MVP, who's going to hit one out of the park on any given night in baseball. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list with FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, America's number one sportsbook. Full disclosure, I'm a very cadence-oriented person as far as the show. So you can imagine my cadence being a little bit disrupted when my watch goes off with a notification for the Dolphins with a roster move. The Dolphins announcing that they had waived Matthew Sexton, and in a short follow-up that just now came through, officially formalized the signing of, quote, defensive tackle Calais Campbell. Dolphins themselves announcing and introducing Calais Campbell as a defensive tackle. Interesting. Kind of sets your expectations on where snaps are going to come. And we did that show last week. So, Calais Campbell, hopefully now that this signing is official, we can get these contract numbers sooner rather than later. But here's kind of what facilitated me doing the show. Before the Calais Campbell signing happens, and the Dolphins waiving Matthew Sexton, that was not a top 51 player. He was tied for the lowest cap commitment that the Dolphins could possibly have, $795,000. Overthecap.com has the Dolphins pre-Calais Campbell signing at $16.89 million in cap space. Calais Campbell is going to check in somewhere, presumably between 2.5, if they put void years on the back end of it, to $6 or $7 million would be my guess, right? It's not a small amount of money. His signing will bump Lester Cotton off of the top 51. And remember, until you get to 53-man cuts, only your top 51 count against the cap. So by pushing Lester Cotton off, whatever Calais Campbell is on the books for from a salary cap perspective, that minus Lester Cotton's $1.125 million is what they need in salary cap space. So if they sign him for a 1-year, $7 million contract, and he signs for $7 million, and they don't do anything with it, and it's a $7 million cap hit, they need about 5.88. I'm not going to do any more of that math. $5.875 million in cap space. So you would subtract that off of the 16.89 that the Dolphins currently have in cap space. That's the first piece of this puzzle. But as I'm looking at the roster and I'm looking at the top 51, you say, okay, whatever their salary cap space is, you're going to need to add at least 2 more players worth of salary cap hits to it to get their actual salary cap forecast for the season in 2024. And this is where it gets interesting, because below the 51-man cutoff right now, it'd be easy to just say, we'll take the top 2 guys, add them to it, and that's your salary cap. But there's a lot of guys below the 51-man cutoff that I would presume or assume or be inclined to think have a really good to great chance to make the roster. For example, River Craycraft, $1.1 million, not amongst the top 51 players for the Dolphins. Jody Fortson, not amongst the top 51 players to make the roster. I don't think Skylar Thompson makes the 53 based on the new quarterback rules, but it's worth acknowledging the Dolphins did carry 3 quarterbacks last year on the 53, and Skylar Thompson is not above the 51-man cutoff. Kader Kohu is not above the 51-man cutoff. That's what, 1, 2, 3, 4 guys right there. Jalen Wright is not above the 51-man cutoff. There's 4 guys. Reminder, you only need 2, or you only get 2, I should say. So you're already looking at, if those guys all made the roster, you'd have to cut at least 2 guys above the 51-man cutoff. That does not include Chris Brooks, Julian Hill, Keon Smith, Ethan Bonner, Muhammad Kamara, Malik Washington, Taj Washington. You get the point. You're looking at potentially, and this is where I think it softens the blow of a Calais Campbell signing. If you cut a player with a $2 million salary cap hit in favor of a player that's got a $985,000 cap hit, like a Kader Kohu or a Keon Smith, you're getting an extra $1 million back in salary cap space. So right now you're sitting at about 17. You're going to add Calais Campbell to these ranks, but you're also, when you cut to 53, you're probably going to be keeping a number of players below the 51-man cutoff that are currently not counting against the cap in favor of players that are above the 51-man cutoff. So when you add them too, you're going to be pocketing more salary cap space. I look at kind of the fringe players above, players that are below $2 million, but above 1.125, which is the Lester Cotton contract that is currently kind of the last on the 51. There's some really interesting players in this group, including some players that are rookie contract players. There's a lot of healthy competition for snaps. I think it kind of gives you an idea of what the pecking order is for the defensive line. I think it kind of gives you an idea what the pecking order is for some other special teams type of spots on the roster. And that's very helpful for the clarity in these areas of this Dolphins roster that are very crowded. There's a lot of new. You're, of course, going to let it play out and let the guys who win the jobs in training camp win the jobs, right? That's one of the things that Mike McDaniel is very intentional about. He's like, we're not going to come in with preconceived notions. We're going to let the players tell us what roles they deserve with the team based on how they play. Now, it's not always that way. You're paying a guy $15 million, he's probably going to play, right? But if it's a difference of a guy with a 1.7 salary cap hit versus a $1.15 million salary cap hit, the players are going to get a chance to sort that out. But you at least get an idea of what the Dolphins' expectations are based on what they invested into the players. I look at Neville Gallimore. It's a great example. He's got a $1.125 million salary, which is vet minimum salary for a player with his tenure. But he got a $665,000 signing bonus. That's not a small amount of money. You contrast that, a $665,000 signing bonus, with Tier Tart, who got the same $1.125 million base salary. But Tier Tart was one of those players who the Dolphins did the vet minimum guarantee rule with. He only got a $167,000 signing bonus. They gave Neville Gallimore effectively $500,000 more to sign in Miami. And I think if you asked anybody right now, like, hey, what's your pecking order for the defensive line? Most people would probably have Tier Tart in front of Neville Gallimore. Well, the Dolphins gave Neville Gallimore a signing bonus that was almost $500,000 more. What does that say about Miami's expectations? That certainly doesn't guarantee anything, but there's a number of examples of this along the way that I think are worth our attention. We're going to look at a few more of them here next on this episode of Locked On Dolphins with chopping block players. As we look at the Dolphins and their current state of affairs, that's next here on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Players in this stratosphere of less than 2 million, but more than 1.1 million. Just on the defensive line alone, you have Jonathan Harris in this stratosphere. You have Benito Jones in this stratosphere. You have Neville Gallimore in this stratosphere. You have Tier Tart and Deshaun Hand all in this stratosphere. The two lowest investments that Miami gave from a signing bonus perspective went to Deshaun Hand and Tier Tart. They were both players that signed the vet minimum as far as a way to scrape a little bit off against the top from salary cap standpoint. And that is, again, if there's a reminder from the beginning of the show, players that have tenure, their minimum salary goes up. But in order to incentivize teams to not flush players that have increased minimum salaries down the toilet to never be seen again, new with the collective bargaining agreement in 2020, you can sign a player to a vet minimum salary with a capped signing bonus that just so happens to be $167,000. And only the true floor minimum, not the tenured vet minimum, but the true minimum salary plus the signing bonus counts gets capped. So it's a few $100,000 here, it's a few $100,000 there. But to know that Miami gave the negligible signing bonuses to Deshaun Hand and Tier Tart at $167,000 apiece with a minimum salary based on their tenure, as compared to Neville Gallimore getting $665,000, as compared to Jonathan Harris getting almost twice the signing bonus that Deshaun Hand and Tier Tart did at $300,000. Benito Jones got a $250,000 signing bonus. Like, all of these things act as clues for who's going to shake it out and take the roster spots. Now, again, if it's a difference of one player is definitively better than the other, but one of those players is $500,000 less or more, you would take the better players. It's not so much dead cap space that you can't stomach the idea of taking, because you'd keep the better player for the more expensive player's cap hit anyway, right? It's just the math would work out that way. So you're invested. My budget for this position is this much regardless. It's just, am I going to pay the guy who's playing it the whole thing, or am I going to pay the guy who's playing it 80% of it and the other 20% of it is sunk cost from another player who I signed in the offseason who I think could do it? This also applies to special teams. Saran Neal signed a hefty special teams contract with a $350,000 signing bonus, but he also got almost $500,000 in bonuses as far as per game active bonuses. So that gives you some more clues too, where, you're looking for these divides in investment on who's going to make the roster and who's not. I'd be inclined to say anybody who got incentivized money for per game active bonuses, and that includes Jonathan Harris. He got that language in his contract. Those guys are probably guys that you feel good about making the roster. So who doesn't? In this stratosphere of players, less than $2 million, but more than 1.1 as far as the 51-man cutoff, who does not have any offset kind of incentivized money based on games that you dress for? It's easier to identify the guys that do have it first. Saran Neal, Jordan Poyer, Jonathan Harris, Robert Jones. He got $350,000. Isaiah Wynn got over $500,000. Elijah Campbell got over $250,000. And then Nick Needham, who was one of those players that got the vet minimum benefit contract. He did get $667,500 in per game active bonuses. Cam Brown got a regular roster bonus that is $83,000, and that, I don't know if there's the details of that are specified as far as when that roster bonus is due. So that's an interesting one. That's the one that kind of has a different kind of structured bonus. But those guys having stipulated money in their contract seems to give you an idea that there's an inside track. So the guys that don't have that, Neville Gallimore, but he got the big signing bonus. Jack Driscoll, but he got a $400,000 signing bonus. Benito Jones. Then you're into rookie contracts. Anthony Walker doesn't have any guarantees or any stipulated money. Deshaun Hand, Tier Tart, Lester Cotton, and that's it for guys above the 51 player cutoff. Guys that are just below the 51 player cutoff, Jody Fortson's probably the most notable player. He got $200,000 in per game active bonuses throughout the course of the season. So maybe that gives him an inside track. Maybe it doesn't. I don't think it does because it's not guaranteed, but it at least gives you the idea that the Dolphins wanted to incentivize and sweeten the pot to get a player like this. So that you feel like if they were willing to put something like that in there, this was a targeted signing for them, that you'd like to see a player come out and kind of earn the role. So we've talked a little bit throughout the course of this offseason about how only 2 of the Dolphins players in the draft class go above the 51-man cutoff, but every one of those players that makes it, somebody that's above 51 is going to have to cut off, and come off, except for, once you get past two new players. Tier Tart, I think this, kind of reviewing this and looking at the dollar distribution, Deshaun Hand and Tier Tart are kind of 2 guys that I think this puts you some pretty big risk with. I think this gives me a little bit less confidence in Anthony Walker Jr. as well, although you have a track record of a player who's, when healthy, has been a productive NFL linebacker. Can Channing Tindall hold him off? Would Channing Tindall need to hold him off? Would they keep him all anyway? That doesn't even get into Duke Riley, but that's a whole other conversation. Duke is somebody who's you could save about $2.5 million of between his base salary, and then he's got per game active bonuses that are not guaranteed, that if you moved on, you could save $2.5 million in salary cap space there. Interesting decisions for Miami. And if you move on from a player like that, now you're talking about pocketing, potentially 1.5 if you kept Kader Kohu, who's not on the 51, right? Say you added River Craycraft and Jody Fortson at $1 million apiece. And if you kept Kader Kohu in lieu of Duke Riley and kept the other linebackers that you had on the books, you're talking pocketing over $1.5 million in cap space for that personnel decision. I'm just going to have to sort through all of that. And we won't know what it ultimately looks like until they do the 53-man cuts. But it's a storyline amidst this offseason where cap management has been so in focus because Miami had spent aggressively and they have big contracts and they're going to need to transition through some of them. Hasn't really been looked at until now, at least not on this program. I teased it yesterday. Got a little bit more confirmation. We do have a guest coming tomorrow afternoon on the show. So there will be a Wednesday show that happens. And then Thursday show, presumably, we're going to have a very special guest on the program. Again, don't want to say any names until the interview is done, just because I know sometimes there's last-minute change of plans or schedule conflicts. But we have a Hall of Famer coming on the show with us this week, which I'm fired up for. You can find out who it is. You can follow me on X, Twitter, whatever, at Grinding the Tape. You can find our shows here on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. I appreciate you guys checking out Locked On Dolphins. Make it a great rest of your day. I'm out of here. Fins up.